Hello, and welcome to Expert Subjects Weekly Podcast. This week, we'll be discussing what to write about. If you tuned into our previous podcasts or read the articles, you're no longer blocked, you have a great writers group, or an incredible bunch of resources at your writer's fingertips. So, what is it that you choose to write about? The options before you shimmer like phosphorescence in the nighttime ocean. You may be one of those fortunate writers who never has to agonize over your next project. You may, in fact, have a notebook you have scrawled in for years, crammed with ideas. You may have 10 such notebooks packed with incredible and inspiring material. But if this isn't the case, don't worry. You may come upon only one or two inspirational ideas in your entire lifetime. But if you allow them to carry you on that unmapped journey we all trek as writers, you may end up with an opus as worthy as Dickens or Joyce. First, let's look at the work of some successful writers we adore and respect and how they land on the subjects of their prose. Joyce Carol Oates is right up there on that list. She churns out flawless writing and never seems to run dry on subject matter. I remember my beginnings in creative writing and my father encouraging me with books and chats about different writers he loved. He mentioned Joyce Carol Oates and told me she sometimes turned to newspaper articles or to real events to launch her fiction. This was a comfort to me because as a young writer, I felt my early experiences were all I had to draw upon. I worried about the day when my personal creative supplies would be exhausted. But with a newspaper in front of me one summer morning and trying to think like Miss Oates, I scanned the articles with a different sort of eye. What story could be embellished? What characters could be fleshed out? Was anything there in black type to spin my creative wheels? Not only can current news give you ideas for your writing, whether it's your next essay or blog or short story, but you can also comb through old newspapers, magazines, the history of your town, or even the history of your house. The summer I was 10 or so, a teenage girl was murdered in our upstate New York town. This was the first murder of a young girl I was aware of, and so her death sat with me as the police searched for her body. She had last been seen walking by the lake we swam in. They dredged but did not find her at the murky bottom. Finally, they found her in a farmer's cornfield. 10 years later, I wrote a short story about this tragic murder. I wrote it for the loss of innocence. I wrote it for the pretty 16-year-old girl with dark hair who had lost her life to an evil man who got off, moved to Florida, and killed again before he was put away. Look at the news for stories you feel need to be told. There are plenty of other writers who cull their ideas from the media. Some of you may be familiar with the play Equus. I unfortunately have never seen it, but heard all about Harry Potter's nudity on the stage, and more importantly learned that Peter Shaffer, who wrote the play in 1973, based it on an actual event. A 17-year-old boy who blinded half a dozen horses in Suffolk, England. Shaffer took this violent act and constructed his dramatic web around it, the end result being the successful play that has resonated for decades. Something about that senseless act against those poor horses inspired him to create a powerful drama. In addition to current news, however, writers find plenty of other inspiring sources. My youngest son and I heard Joyce Carol Oates read from Wild Nights at Skidmore's Summer Writers Institute. This brilliant book paints the last days of 5 writers' lives: Dickinson, Twain, Poe, James, and Hemingway. We heard Oates read from the Hemingway section, and it was an experience I will never forget. Oates climbed into Hemingway's mind in such a way that it felt as if Papa himself had penned her words. Writers can borrow from life, from the lives of others, but in order to succeed, you need to connect with what you are borrowing from. Joyce Carol Oates obviously connected with Ernest Hemingway, her love for writing, and her respect for his. Historic fiction comes from much the same place. Writers glance back over their shoulders and find an era or an event that intrigues them. When writers create around a shared history, they have a common ground. Even if each of us brings our own interpretation to the history, there's an understanding nonetheless. Think of Marilyn Monroe, or September 11th, or the assassination of Lincoln, Kennedy, or Martin Luther King. With historic fiction comes research. The details you provide must be authentic to that period, or you need to hold them back. The writers who succeed are masters in this arena. The Girl with a Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier, or The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory, are two examples of successful historic fiction. In some ways, using history as your backdrop takes away the burden of having to create your own universe, but the burden becomes being authentic, if authenticity is what you are striving for on the page. Next week, we'll discuss taking material from your own life to create memoir, creative nonfiction, and fiction of many genres. Thank you for listening to Expert Subjects Weekly Podcast, and feel free to read this week's article on what to write. Please join us again next time.